Everything you have been told about the Olympics is missing the most important part of the original story. The first games in 776 BC were not a celebration of athletic excellence. They were a religious ritual staged to impress a god who was believed to be physically present. One barefoot man named Charybdis ran a single sprint down a dirt track and was handed a wreath of olive leaves as his only reward. The question nobody asks is why that moment felt more sacred to its audience than any gold medal ever has. Zeus wasn't a distant symbol to the Greeks, he was a tenant, and Olympia was his address. The sanctuary at Olympia existed before the race did, and every structure on that plain was built to serve him first and spectators second. When Charybdis crossed that finish line, the crowd wasn't cheering an athlete's personal triumph over rivals. They were watching a man prove himself worthy of divine attention in front of the god himself. That distinction changes everything about how you picture that day, because the valley those Greeks gathered in wasn't a stadium. It was a temple with open sky for a roof. What did it actually look like, smell like, and feel like to stand there in the summer heat of 776 BC? Two rivers meet in the western Peloponnese, and the Greeks believed the gods had chosen that exact spot on purpose. The Alpheus and the Claudios pressed together at a low floodplain ringed by soft hills, and in summer, the heat there is almost physical, like a hand pressing down on your shoulder. Inside that bowl of land sat a sacred grove called the Altus, dense with wild olive trees and the smell of ash and animal fat from centuries of burnt offerings. No temple dominated the skyline yet in 776 BC. The great structures would come later, but the ground itself was already ancient with ritual. At the center stood an altar unlike any other in Greece, a mound of compacted ash built entirely from the charred remains of every ox sacrificed to Zeus across hundreds of years. Pilgrims who arrived here weren't walking into a stadium. They were walking into a wound in the earth that the gods had never let heal. 3 heralds left Olympia weeks before the games and walked in every direction across a fractured, war-soaked Greece. They carried a message that no king or general could legally ignore, because it came wrapped in the authority of Zeus himself. The sacred truce, the Echecharia, suspended all active conflicts across every city-state for the duration of the festival. Soldiers who had been killing each other last month would now share the same dusty road toward the same valley. Can you imagine what that road actually looked like? Spartans and Athenians, sworn enemies, traveling in the same direction without drawing a sword? The truce didn't mean they liked each other, or trusted each other, or had forgotten a single grievance. It meant a god was watching, and that was enough. Violating the truce carried a punishment so severe, exclusion from the games and a fine payable to Zeus, that even the most ambitious warlord thought twice. This fragile, sacred ceasefire was the only architecture holding the entire festival together, and everyone walking that road knew it. The first name in the history of sport belongs to a cook. Not a warrior, not a nobleman, not someone who trained under a famous teacher. Just a man named Charybdis who lived in Elis, the city that hosted the games. We don't know his age, we don't know his build, and we have no image of his face. Only a name scratched into the record because he crossed a finish line first. What we do know is that in 776 BC, he stood barefoot on sun-baked earth, stripped of every garment, and ran roughly 1 stadium length before a crowd that believed they were watching something the gods themselves had arranged. That's about 192 meters, shorter than 2 American football fields, and yet that single sprint made him immortal in a way no battlefield promotion ever could. So what did it actually feel like to run that race, on that ground, with everything on the line? The starter's call cuts through the heat, and 20 bare feet press into the baked earth of Olympia's track. Every man standing in that line has traveled days through summer dust to run a single straight sprint of 192 meters. No relay, no javelin, no wrestling. Just this, just them, just the sun hammering down on oiled skin and taut muscle. The crowd packed along the earthen banks doesn't sit, they lean forward, thousands of them, breathing the same scorched air as the runners. When the signal drops, the sound that rises isn't cheering. It's something closer to a single held gasp, a whole hillside inhaling at once. Feet tear the dry track. Dust lifts in pale curtains behind each stride, and the finish line rushes toward them in seconds, not minutes. One man pulls clear, Caribus, his arms driving, his face stripped of everything except the raw need to reach that line first. The whole race lasts less time than it takes you to pour a cup of water, and then it's over. The dust still hanging in the air, the crowd breaking into noise, and Caribus standing alone at the far end of the track, wondering perhaps what the gods thought of what they'd just seen. The winner of that race received no gold, no silver, and no prize money of any kind. What they placed on his head was a kotinos, a wreath of wild olive branches cut from a single sacred tree behind the temple of Zeus. It wasn't polished or decorated, and it wasn't meant to be, because its value had nothing to do with the material. The Greeks understood that a beautiful object could be copied, purchased, or stolen, but a blessing from the gods couldn't be transferred to anyone else. That wreath was proof that Zeus had looked down at this particular man and found him worthy. Think about what it meant to live in a world where divine favor was the only currency that mattered. Wealth could vanish with a bad harvest or a lost war, but a kotinos, that was permanent. Every city that man returned to would know the gods had chosen him. So when the Greeks stripped away gold and handed a champion a handful of leaves, they weren't being humble, they were being precise. That single sprint didn't just crown a winner, it gave an entire civilization a way to count time. The Greeks didn't mark their years by kings or harvests, they marked them by Olympiads, the 4-year cycles anchored to that sacred track at Elis. When a historian wanted to say when something happened, he didn't reach for a ruler's name, he reached for a foot race. Think about what that means for a moment. The fall of a city, the birth of a philosopher, the signing of a treaty. All of it measured against the moment a naked man crossed a dirt finish line. Every 4 years, the Greek world stopped its wars, opened its roads, and reset its memory around one sprint in the Peloponnese. Hundreds of games eventually followed. Wrestling, chariot races, the discus, but the stayed race, that first barefoot dash, remained the heartbeat. You can feel the weight of that, a civilization so hungry for divine contact that it built its entire sense of history around a single act of worship. What happened when that hunger finally died is the question that changes everything. Caribus didn't win a medal, a sponsorship deal, or a place in any record book that mattered to him. He won the attention of a god, and in that moment, nothing else in the world came close to mattering. The Greeks didn't build the games to celebrate human excellence as an end in itself. They built them as an offering, a way of saying, Zeus, look at what your people can do. Every stripped-down, sun-scorched body on that starting line was a kind of prayer made physical, a declaration that glory belonged to the divine before it belonged to anyone else. So when you watch an Olympic ceremony today, the flags, the sponsors, the broadcast rights, you're watching the shell of something that once had a living God inside it. We kept the spectacle and lost the belief, and we don't always notice what's missing.